Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Kuf Yud Daled. Today's daf is sponsored by Amy Goldstein in loving memory of her grandmother, Anne Barnett, on her 13th year at site. She was dedicated to the Jewish people and was a lifelong Zionist, and we missed her every day. Okay, we're going to get started from another statement of Rava that he has to talk about Gentiles and Jews and about the court system. So, Machar is Rava v'item Rav Huna, he announced, or maybe it was Rav Huna who announced it, Disalkin la'elu denachlan latata, those who go up and back and forth from Eretz Yisrael. Hi, they say the following. Hi, Bar Yisrael, the Yaga Sahaduta Likuti. If we have a Jew who knows testimony for a kuti, okay, whether we mean specifically kutim here, it seems like they're using this as a general term for Gentiles. Below tavu mine, okay, there's a debate about whether you say these words or not, but they didn't insist he come to testify in court. And he goes to the kuti court to testify for a fellow Jew. That's against a fellow Jew. Okay, some people say that he's testifying for kuti. Some people say even if he's testifying for a Jew against another Jew, it's a problem, and you'll see why in a minute. We put this person in we excommunicate them. Why is this? My time because he's going to a court where the rules are that they accept one witness's testimony and they'll force one guy to pay the other over based on your testimony. And Jewish courts don't allow for that thing. And you're basically causing a Jew to lose out based on a principle that goes against Jewish law, that one witness is allowed to take money out of the hands from one to the other. Now, this is something we don't do in Jewish law. It's very interesting in this case that even though you're not the judge, you would think this is only an issue for judges. Judges can't allow money to be taken out from one witness for the other. This is basically saying that you as a witness shouldn't go testify when you're the only witness because you're causing money to be taken out of the hands of one Jew into the hands of another, or out of the hands of a kuti into a Jew into the hands of a kuti against Jewish law. Okay, now you're not liable for damages. We're just excommunicating you because you shouldn't be promoting this type of thing. And therefore, the Gemara continues to say, Lo maran el echad. This is only if it's one person, though. You're only one witness. But if you're two witnesses, then obviously you can go, because even though it's a Gentile court, we allow you to go testify because they'll accept two witnesses are acceptable in the Jewish court as well. And even one of them, we're only saying, Rashi says Megista is in the villages, because in the villages they accepted one witness. But if it was the big, municipal courts, let's call them, if based on one witness, they're going to institute an oath, meaning they're going to say, if you want to get your money, right? Well, if you want to not have to pay that person, take an oath, and then you can exempt yourself. But that's just like Jewish law, and because they have the same laws as Jewish law, therefore we will allow you to testify on your own. Amar Rav Ashi. When I was in Rav Huna's house, they asked the following question: Adam chashuv an important person who we rely on, who they rely on in their courts, like two people. Okay, in Jewish courts, we don't care if you're prominent, not prominent, but they'll rely on you like two people. And they will take money out based on, they'll say, oh yeah, this one important person testified against someone else. They're going to require them to pay the money. And therefore, you can't testify if you're an Adam Chashuv. Or is it possible, since he's a prominent person, if he doesn't testify, they're going to get very angry and they say, what, this prominent person won't testify in our courts? And many of the commentaries use the words here, Chilul Hashem, right? It will be a desecration of God's name. And therefore, maybe he needs to testify and we should not stop him from testifying. And the Gemara answers, Teku, we don't have an answer. The background to this next section, two things you need to know. One is the laws of bar mitzvah, which is basically, and we'll see in a minute, that the way it works is, if I want to sell my property, the first thing I do is I go to my next door neighbor, and my next door neighbor has first dibs to my property. And really, it's not so much a responsibility of the seller, this we're going to see inside, it's the responsibility of the buyer. If I go sell my land to somebody else, they have to make sure that my next door neighbor doesn't want to buy the property before they do. Okay, the obligation of the bar mitzvah is actually on the one purchasing. You can't block someone else, the next door neighbor, from purchasing, because for them it's much more financially advantageous to have two fields or two houses right next to each other. So therefore, they have first dibs. The other thing you need to know, which is the more difficult part of this sugya, is that Gentiles in those days were considered danger. They were considered dangerous to live next door to one. They might do something terrible to you. The Jews were scared of the Gentiles in those days, okay, which still happens in some places today, particularly with the recent surge in anti-Semitism. But I don't think it's the way they viewed it those days, where they really were scared, like really scared to live next door to a Gentile. Nowadays, most people are not very scared to live next to most Gentiles. It's not really a scary thing. But so because of that, Rav Ashi says the following: Hi Bar Yisrael, dezaven le'ar le'ovei kochavim, a metzra de Bar Yisrael chatzlei. If you sell your land to a Gentile, right next door to a Jew who's your neighbor, mishamtina le, you're put in excommunication. Now the question is why? My timer, mishum dina de bar metzra. Is it because you didn't offer them to your next door neighbor to have first dibs? But didn't we learn zivan me'akum, if you buy it from a Gentile land, or zabin le'akum, or you sell land to a Gentile, leika mishum dina de bar metzra. There is no law of bar metzra here. Now let's try to figure out. If you buy it from a Gentile, why is there no law of bar metzra if you're the buyer? Now, again, what did we say? It's really on the buyer. If you buy the land and don't offer it to your next door neighbor, you buy it from the Gentile, you can say, listen, I was just trying to save you from having to live next door to this Gentile. I was worried that maybe the Gentile, if I didn't buy it right now, maybe you would have rights to buy it, but maybe he would take a better price from somebody else, and you'd end up with another Gentile neighbor next to you. So I was doing you a favor by buying it from the Gentile, and therefore I am not to blame. If I sell it to a Gentile, I'm also not liable, mishum dina de bar metzra. Now that's simply because there's nothing wrong. And again, the issue of bar metzra is on the buyer, not on the seller. So if I sell it to the Gentile, it's not my problem. So in our case, this was selling to a Gentile. It's not an issue of bar metzra. So therefore, what's the issue here? So now what's the problem? And this is where I went back to the beginning. You can claim to me, and this is why we're going to excommunicate me for having sold my property to a Gentile when you're living next door. You're basically putting a lion right next to me, and maybe this person will attack me and injure me or my family members. You're putting me in danger, and therefore, mishamtina le. Now, here, if you weren't convinced that the issue was really fear of, again, either financial damage or physical damage, and here it could be they weren't really scared of them killing them, but they were worried that they were going to steal things from them. They worried they were going to cause damage to their fields. So here they say, until you accept all of the onus, all of the responsibilities for anything that might happen to me because of my terrible neighbor now, my new neighbors here, you have to basically, since they basically excommunicate me as the seller and say, until you assume all responsibility for any damage that might be caused by these new neighbors. So again, hard to understand this. We shouldn't be so discriminatory against Gentiles. On the other hand, you have to understand it in a society they were living in. And this comes up, we saw it in Eruvin also, where they were living with the Gentiles. And it was this big, they were scared to live among Gentiles. There obviously must have been some real concerns in those days. As, like I said, now in recent times, we seem to be having more issues with this. When I grew up, I was living in a community where every Friday night for a few weeks in a row, some of the people in the area, as anti-Semitic acts, were throwing beer bottles in our windows. So it happened then, it happens now, it happened, hopefully it won't, this problem won't continue, but we know that there are times where anti-Semitism is high and actions of Gentiles against Jews do get to a certain point, and that's what these sugyot must be based on. Okay. Next, right, and not just randomly being discriminatory against Gentiles, but really being concerned out of a fear. New Mishna. So we're back to issues of gezeila, of theft, and about issues of yeush. Okay, of when do people give up their rights to things, in which situations, and what are the ramifications of that? So if the mochsin are the people who basically come, they're the tax collectors, and there's always concern tax collectors are stealing things inappropriately, right? They're taking things they shouldn't be taking. So they take your donkey, and they give you a different donkey. They take your nice, beautiful donkey, and they give you a, not as good donkey that was obviously somebody else's. So now the question is, you have stolen property that was given to you. So how do we deal with that? Natzlo listim exuto. Robbers come, they take your clothes, and they give you something else to wear. Again, probably less, not as nice. You get to keep them. Why do you get to keep them? Because the Baalim had Yeush. Now Rashi points out here, again, Yeush is not enough. You need shinui reshut, but there's shinui reshut here. It was, number one, they had Yeush, but that doesn't allow the one who stole it to actually acquire it. But when they turn it into someone else's reshut, they give it over to you, that change in ownership allows you to acquire it, and it now becomes yours. And the assumption here is we assume there was Yeush because of a moches or a listim or a thief comes and grabs something from you. You assume you're not getting it back. This is something we'll discuss further. However, the next line seems to a little bit contradict that, because the next line says, Hamatzil min hanahal o min agayis o min listim. If you take something from a river where probably whoever lost it doesn't think they're ever going to get it back again. You might remember my story. I mentioned once about a GoPro that we found in a river in I think it was in Laos, and on some tiul, on some hike there, and we ended up finding whose it was, because a GoPro you can plug in and find who the owner was, and returned it to someone in Florida or something crazy like that. But usually when you lose something like that, you don't think you're ever going to get it back. Or minagais, or the troops came into town and they just took your stuff, and you don't think you're ever getting that back, or min alistim, or from robbers. If the owners had Yeush, then they become yours. Now here it's a little bit trickier, because what do you mean? Why don't we assume there was Yeush like there was in the previous? This seems to imply that you need to know that the original owners assumed they were never getting it back. In other words, again, what's the assumption? So when the guys, right, we're going to have that. So the nahar, so you're not actually stealing it. So that why Yeush and then picking it up is going to be enough. The guys, we're assuming they took it away from someone else. Again, this is taking something, sorry, I don't think I said it really right, which is you're taking something that was stolen by somebody else, okay? So you're kind of saving some item that they stole from someone else, and you're taking it from them. So if they had Yeush, then you can acquire it for yourself. Now, the Gemara is going to ask, and Rashi already tells us here, so maybe we'll look at Rashi. Rashi says, only if you heard that they actually said, oh, I'm never getting this back again. But stama lo, and then how does that relate to the previous? Because this is a listim, and the previous was a listim, and there we said it worked, and we assumed there was Yeush. Here we don't assume there's Yeush. So the Gemara is going to answer later that it could be, depending on whether the listim were Gentiles or Jews, and we'll see which way it falls, whether we can assume there was Yeush, or we have to wait to know that you actually really gave up hope of trying to get it back again. Same thing if you have bees that are making honey, and it's your hive of bees. So now here in this case, sorry, the nechil is not yours, but you find a nechil of dvorim. So if nityashu, if the owners said we're never getting back again because they flew off and they don't know where to find them, then you can acquire them. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Brocha, we're going to ask in the Gemara why they had to add this case, what the chidush is, what's the new halacha here. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Brocha, another topic, and connected with this nechil of dvorim, this beehive. If you see a swarm of bees, we can believe a woman or a child who usually aren't believed in court. We're going to believe them to say, we saw it came from there, meaning you know exactly who the owner is. This is a new halacha, but also connected with this nechil of dvorim. You can go into someone else's field to get your nechil. If your whole bees flew over to someone else's, you can go in there and get it. But if you damage in the process of going into their field, you have to pay for the damages. You might remember this, we came across this before. Here we're going to see you cannot cut if they're all on a branch. You can't cut the branch of someone else's tree and bring it back to your house. You have to kind of get the bees off the branch. You can't just cut the branch and then even if you're going to compensate the owner for it. But Rabbi Yochanan ben Brocha he says you actually can cut the branch. And this is what we saw. And we're going to quote it later at the end of this section, as this is part of those takanot that Yehoshua instituted and said, no, this is something that we do because on account of living together and being accommodating to one another, Yoshua gave the people the land of Israel, and you're allowed to actually do that. You can cut someone's branch, just make sure to compensate them. So now we're going to bring a braita that seems to contradict our Mishna. Kamma, Natana, im natal, machzir lebalim harishonim. Going back to the first case, if you took from this, the mochsin gave you this donkey, if you took it, you have to actually return it to the original owners. You don't have any right to keep this stolen item. This opinion obviously holds that Yeush is not sufficient to acquire an item. Just because someone thinks they're not going to get it back doesn't mean that you could become the owner if it was stolen property. And ultimately, it got your hands through Isur. This was stolen. We don't allow Yeush. This is different, by the way, than something, a lost item that's found, because there was no act of theft that went on. Some people say no. That braita didn't mean you have to return it. You can keep it, but if you want to return it, you can go return it to the original owners if you want. Now, what is this telling you? It's telling you you don't have to return it to the moches. You don't return it to the tax collector. You return it to the original owners. My time, in other words, really, Yeush is Kona. But what? If you say, listen, I just can't deal with having a stolen item in my property, then you return it to the original owners. Now we're going to the next line. So we said these are yours because, right, with the donkey and the donkey from the moches and the clothes from the listim, from the robber, those all become yours. Because we assumed there was Yeush. Amar Rav Ashi, lo shanu ela listim ovei kochavim. Wait, this is only Gentile robbers. Aval listim Yisrael lo. But if it was a Jewish robber, you think, oh, Jewish robber, I'll get my money back from the robber down the road. And therefore there's no Yeush. Right? You figure, I'll bring the guy to court, I'll figure out who he is, I'll bring him to court, also as a listing, maybe that means you knew who it was. I'll find him, I'll bring him to court, and I'll get my item back. But a Gentile, you figure there's no way I'm getting it back, and therefore that's why we assume there was Yeush. So it's only Gentile, the first part of the Mishna. But Rav Yosef knocks this out and says, Matkefla Rav Yosef, you could say the exact opposite. Akum dedaine begete lo miyash. The Gentile courts are very strong and tough. Then, if it's in a Gentile court, because a Gentile stole it, I can bring him to a Gentile court. There's no way I'm not going to get him convicted. They have very strong courts. Now, why do they have stronger courts? We're going to see than the Jewish courts. Because, think about it, okay? If you're in, let's say, America, for example, there's a regular court. That's a serious place. Then there's a Beis Din. Now, a Beis Din, right? I'm calling it a Beis Din because that's what they usually call them in America. It's really a Beit Din. But a Beis Din is usually, it doesn't have much authority. Now, why don't they have much authority? Because their authority is given to them by Jewish law, not by the law of the land. And they don't have as much power because they're not the ones in power in America, right? The Beis Din aren't officially recognized. The truth is, I don't know, maybe they have some official recognition, but generally they're not courts of law of the state, of the country. So because of that, now that makes sense now. We're going to say they have real serious courts. Lo miyash, I think I'll get my money back. But Yisrael, kevan da'amar meimar, kevan da'amri meimar, they just speak, meaning the courts issue a ruling, but they have no way to enforce their rulings. Okay, they really don't. This is a big problem in the Beis Din. They can't really enforce their rulings. And right, it's the same thing nowadays. And therefore, miyash, therefore you figure, if it's a Jew, I'm really, now it's interesting. They didn't bring Jews to civil court. Nowadays, you might go with a Jew to a civil court if you have an issue like this, not to a Beis Din. But basically, because of that, miyash, right? I think I'll never get it back. So he says you can't say that that's the reason in the beginning, that it's only Gentile, not Jewish. It should be the opposite. It should be only Jewish. We assume there was Yeush. So Ella, right, Jewish court. Ella itmar sefid. So now we say, okay, forget that. It really was referring this. Now, what happened? Rav Ashi said the Mishna is talking about listim, sorry, not Jewish court, Jewish robber, Gentile robber, Jewish robber. He says the Mishna was talking about a Gentile robber, not a Jewish robber. A Jewish robber, now we thought he was talking about the first line, which meant only a Gentile robber is there Yeush. And then they said, no, it's specifically the opposite. There's no Yeush from a Gentile robber. You think you'll get your money back. So therefore, Yitmar Sefer Yitmar. It must be his statement was made on the latter part of the Mishnah, which was Hamatzil mina akum umina listim, the second line. Im mityashu abalim im stamalo. Now the second line, and now we're going to finally resolve the contradiction between the first and the second. This is what Rashi quoted before. The first line said we assume there's Yeush. The second line said we don't assume there's Yeush, only if you know there was Yeush. That line where it says only if you know there was Yeush, that's when the robber was a Gentile robber. Because if you don't know there was Yeush, then we assume the person didn't have Yeush and wants to get their item back. Because they think, right, Lo shanu ala akum, mishum dedayne begete. Aval listim Yisrael, kebanda amar meimar meyayish. But the Resha was talking about a Jew. And since it's a Jew, you assume, oh, I'll definitely never get this money back because I won't be able to get him to pay just from the Jewish courts. So that was the first issue we really dealt with here, which is distinguishing between the first case and the second case. And it came about because we thought Rav Ashi made a statement on the first line. It turned out he made it on the second. Now we're going to quote a Mishnah, Tanan Hatam. And now we're going to talk again about Yeush and whether we assume, in which cases we assume, in which cases we don't assume that the owners were miyash. Okay, now we're in a Mishnah in Keilim. Now the issue is that when does something become susceptible to impurity? When you decide it's important enough that it's a utensil. But it really depends on, now, if I take something, a piece of leather, that's not really so usable, but I decide to use it as a cover for my couch, I can turn that into, this point, it's a finished product because I'm using it. But that's only if I'm a regular person, meaning I don't use it for selling. But this is just my house and I'm using it in my house. So, that's a balabayit. As soon as I decide I'm using it for something in my house that has use, it's considered a finished product, and that means it could be susceptible to impurity. What if it's unfinished? It's not susceptible to impurity. Vishel abdan, but if I'm a tanner and this is what I do, and I work with the leather all the time, and I sell my leather, then, and I just decide to use this unfinished piece, it's not going to be considered finished yet, because chances are after I use it a little bit in my house, I'm going to take it out of my house, I'm going to go finish it up, I'm going to turn it into something else, and only then will it be a finished product, because my finished product is really only what I can actually sell, because I generally sell them. Now, that's not so relevant yet. Shel gazlan, if it's something I stole, and then I decide to use it as a cover to my couch, even though it's unfinished, my thoughts don't really do anything. It doesn't make it susceptible to impurity. Why? Because we assume that the original owner hasn't had Yeush, okay? The working assumption, if I stole it in broad daylight from you, you know who I am, you assume you're going to get this item back because you know who I am. But shel ganav, if I came in secretly in the middle of the night and stole it, as soon as I think to use it for something, it's basically mine. And my machshava can turn it into susceptible to impurity because you don't think you're ever going to find me because I snuck in the middle of the night. You don't even know who I am. And therefore there's Yeush. Now, Rabbi Shimon, he says, what are you talking about? It's the exact opposite between the ganav and gazlan. Shel gazlan machshava metamatan. It's a gazlan who's a violent person. When I mugged you, right, I did it by gunpoint or with a knife or something like that. I'm a very rough person. You think, oh, I'll never get it back from Michelle. No way, no how. She's scary. But shel ganav, but if I snuck in the middle of the night, I'm a bit of a coward because I came in the middle of the night. And here he explicitly says that even though until now it hadn't talked about Yeush, but that was obviously what was underlying this whole thing. We assume that they're hoping they're going to get it back from me because I'm a coward anyway. Hopefully they'll find me and they'll get it back. So that's this Mishnah in Keilim. Comes Ula and says, Amar Ula, machloket bestam. This machloket is when we don't know anything. Okay, what do we assume? What kind of assumptions do we make about Yeush? Aval biyadua, but if we know the owner was miyayish, and this sounds pretty obvious, divrei hakol Yeush kani. If we know the owner said, I'll never get this back, then the gazlan actually becomes the owner of the item. Again, the gazlan, of course, always has to return it, but it means in terms of ownership laws, and there were all sorts of ramifications, like in Keilim, if they become the owner, if they can basically determine when it's going to be susceptible to impurity, even if it's not a finished product. Also in our Mishnah, if it's given to somebody else and there's Yeush and shinui reshut, right, it could be Kom. Raba amal, biyadua nami machloket. Raba says, even if we know they were mesiach, and here Raba says something very interesting, and this is going to be problematic in light of some things we saw. I asked 3 questions on Raba very shortly. So Raba says, even if we know that the owner had Yeush, there's no such real thing of Yeush. People always have some hope they're going to get their item back when it was stolen. And therefore, this, right, the machloket is specifically, do we think okay, now we're going to say the following, okay, depending on whether you're Rabbi Shimon or the rabbis, in the case where they said, they're basically going to say, even when you know there was Yeush, we're going to assume there was no Yeush, either for Ganav or for Gazlan, depending on whether you say, because they're scary. No one's ever going to have Yeush from a Gaz. Because a Ganav is cowardly. There's always going to be, right, you're never going to have Yeush. Even if you know there was Yeush, you still don't really, we still assume the person's really not giving up hope. And according to the first one, that the Gazlan is Yeush because there's no Yeush because you think you'll get it back from them because you know exactly who you're looking for. Again, we're going to say, according to Raba, well, that's across the board. Even if the original owner claims, I don't think I'll ever get it back, they really still hold out hopes that they're going to get the item back, and there's no real Yeush ever. So now we're going to have some questions on Raba. Don't argue with Ula. Because look, the Mishna says that we just read. The last line of Rabbi Shimon was, because they didn't have Yeush, not because they never have Yeush, right? The reason is because they didn't give up hope. But it would be yours. You would own it, and then your machshava would cause it to become impure just by thinking, right? Becoming, again, susceptible to become impure just by thinking it, because it would be yours. So it seems to go against what you just said, Rabbi. So no. The way I read it is because there is no Yeush for owners. When somebody steals something, Rava thinks there really is no Yeush, okay? So he says there is no such thing, even if you say there really isn't. Second difficulty against Raba, and from here we'll also have a response to this. So the second difficulty against Raba is, okay, Tanan, Natlu Muchsin Chamoro. Oh, our Mishnah, what does it say? Right, our Mishnah said, lefi, hare elu shelo, if they give you a different donkey, it becomes yours. Why? Because mipnei shehbali mityashim mehem. Because the owners are mityash. Okay, now what's the issue here? We're going to see in a minute. Now there's a case of muchsin and there's a case of listing. So now they're going to assume that muchsin are, okay, we're going to see I Rabbanan kasha gazlan. Okay, they're going to say, and let me try to remember which was which, but they say that the muchsin, right, the muchsin come out in the open. And the muchsin are gazlanim. And the listim, even though listim is usually a gazlan, we're going to say the listim must be a ganav. Because why else would they be talking about two things if it weren't ganav gazlan? Okay, so they're going to say the following. In both cases, it's the same because the baalim were mityashim, and it's the same law. So now they're going to say, according to who does this go? Rabbanan, if it's the rabbis, remember, the rabbis said, do we assume there was Yeush? In a ganav case, right, we're going to assume there was Yeush. In a gazlan case, we're going to assume there wasn't Yeush because you assume you knew who stole from you, you're going to get it back. So according to Rabbanan, kasha gazlan, because the rabbis say we assume stam, there is no Yeush. And Mishna says there is Yeush. We assume shabali mityashim, right? We just assume that. Rabbi Shimon, kasha ganav. And if it's Rabbi Shimon, it's the reverse. Because the ganav case, there should be no Yeush according to him, because he said a gazlan, that's the case where you're going to have Yeush because you'll never get it back from the strong, tough guy. But in a ganav case, there is Yeush. So, in a ganav case, we're going to assume, what did I just say? In a gazlan case, because you're scared of them, you are going to be mityayish. In a ganav case, you're not going to have Yeush because you're going to think that you can always get it back from them. So then the ganav case assumes there's no Yeush. So that doesn't work according to the rabbis. According to, the rabbis. So Bishlam, it doesn't, it doesn't work according to the rabbis, it doesn't work according to Rabbi Shimon in the Mishna. Now we're going to get back to Ula and Raba. Now remember what Ula said. Ula understood the way we understood them, which it sort of depends on what the situation is. Ganav this, ganav that, depending on whether you're Rabbi Shimon or the rabbis. But Raba said, and that's a stam case. Raba said, even if we know, they're still going to argue because he really doesn't think there is such a thing the cases where there is no yeush, right? Even if, the cases where we say there is yeush, wherever we assume, we're still going to say, but still, we don't consider that yeush. So bishlam ala ula de amar biyadua kan, hachanami biyadua v'divrei hakol. So now, how are we going to explain this Mishnah? So now we have to think. The Mishnah, okay, our Mishnah, we're going to assume what's that case? We're now going to say it's not a case where we don't know. Because if we don't know, according to Ula, we have this machloket. Ganav or Gazlan, one of them is Yehush, the other one doesn't. Either which way, according to Rabbi Shimon or the rabbis, we don't have Ganav and Gazlan having the same halacha, which appears in our Mishnah. But, so what will we say according to Ula? It must be, in what case is a Ganav and Gazlan the same according to Ula? Biyadua. If we know they had Yehush, then Kana. And maybe the Mishnah is talking about a case where we know they had Yehush for sure. Then, Hachanami biyadua v'divrei hakol. So just like he said, biyadua kane, in the Ganav and Gazlan, if you know they were Yehush, we'll say our Mishnah is exactly that. And that resolves it. But the Raba, here comes the question on Raba. It's a machloket, even if we know. We still don't think that, again, either according to the rabbis or according to Rabbi Shimon, one of those cases is not going to have Yehush. Well, then the Mishnah doesn't make sense because the Mishnah presumes they both have Yehush. So Hamani, lo Rabbanan, lo Rabbi Shimon, it doesn't work. To which they say, how will we answer this? Forget your assumption. Your assumption was this is talking about a Ganav and a Gazlan case. But listim is Rabbi Shimon. Listim is listim who have a gun, put a gun to your head. And muhsin is people who steal. They mug you, but they didn't have a gun. And then they say, Yihachi Hainu Gazlan. So why are they bringing you two different cases? Trey Gavne Gazlan. There are two different Gazlan cases. And they brought you two different Gazlan cases. Okay, not such a big deal. Tashma, we're going to do the exact same thing for this next source, although the next source will have a second answer. And from there, we're going to get off on a bit of a tangent. Tashma, Haganav v'Gazlan v'Ha'anas. Hekdei shanik deshu tronatan truma masrotam masi. A Ganav, a Gazlan, which sounds like Ganav and Gazlan, are two different types, are viewed all as one here. Anas, someone who takes money away forcibly. If they did that, their hekdesh is hekdesh. If they take the money of the thief and sanctifies it to the temple, makes it truma, or gives maaser, it's valid. Now, why is that? Based on Yehush, right? Now, again, we're going to have the same problem. Money, ira banan kasha gazlan, ira b'shimon kasha ganav. Because remember, we assume Yehush, and Rabbanan said we don't assume Yehush by a thief, and Rabbi Shimon said we don't by a gazlan, and Rabbi Shimon said we don't assume Yehush by a ganav. So again, if you say this means if we knew that they had Yehush, then it would be koneh. Then we're going to say your hekdesh works, all that. It's a case where we know for a fact. But remember, Rebbe says even when we know for a fact, we still think each one in a different case, there is no Yehush, and then we're going to have a distinction between Ganav and Gazlan, and that's not what appears in this source. So if you're going to say, Ula biyadua kane hachanami, biyadua v'divrei hakol, and then you're going to say, it's when we know, and then it works both according to Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, because we know for a fact. And they were only arguing about a case where we didn't know if there was Yehush. But Ella l'Rabba damar biyadua nami machloket, but Rabba said, if we know there's still a machloket in that case, Hamane lo Rabbi Shimon lo Rabbanan, then it doesn't match either one because Rava says they have a machloket between the Ganav and the Gazlan. And here it's talking about Ganav and Gazlan as if they have the same halacha. To which we answer, just like we did previously, the Ganav here is not a Ganav. Hachanami belistim mezuyan Rabbi Shimon he. And then we're going to match it up with Rabbi Shimon. We're going to say it's a listim mezuyan. By the way, I didn't explain why it's Rabbi Shimon. Because again, what's the issue? It's a listim mezuyan. And remember, Rabbi Shimon said, we're going to assume listim mezuyan. You definitely had Yehush because, right, I'm a big scary person. I put a gun to your head, no way, right? Or even any Gazlan. You're scared of me. I'm a very violent person. You think you're never going to get your money back. Okay. And then it would work. But listim mezuyan Rabbi Shimon he. Okay. And ihachi, they say, but then it's hainu Gazlan. Then why do you list Ganav and Gazlan separately? They're both Gazlanim. Well, Trey Gavne Gazlan. It's two different types. Yeah. This whole thing started, we had three questions. Question number 2 and question number 3, bringing the source in our Mishnah and bringing this other source about the Maaser and the Hakadesh, where we assume there was Yehush, and then we're saying, according to, right, the case is, according to Rabbi Shimon, right, where it's listed Mizuyan, it's Rabbi Shimon who says basically that the Gazlan, there is always Yehush, right? We assume this Yehush. Now, we're now going to say, if that's the case, the whole problem was it didn't fit with the rabbis or Rabbi Shimon. And that's how we got into this question against Raba. Raba's going to say, right, even when there is Yeush, we don't really treat it as Yeush. So now we're going to answer what? Ibait ema, ha magnitin, Rebbi. We're going to now introduce a third opinion. We thought it was just the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon, but there's also Rebbi. What does Rebbi say? And then it's going to actually, we should have sent this from the very beginning, because this is a very easy way to resolve all of these sources. Okay? Now, so now, what do we have here? Did Tanya Rebbi Omer, because remember, what did Rebbi, I just want to go back to Rava for 1 minute. Rava says, biyadua machloket. Their machloket is a case of yadua. So again, according to Rabbi Shimon, if we know, Rabbi Shimon's going to say, even if we know you had Yeush, in a Ganav case, it's not going to work, but in a Gazlan case, there will be Yeush. And that's what we explained it according to Rabbi Shimon and Gazlan. But now we're going to say there's a third opinion, and it matches Rebbi. Ditanya, Rebbi Omil, Ganav ki Gazlan, and turning out Amabet, V'kaimalan ki Gazlan, the Rabbi Shimon. Rebbi says the Ganav is like a Gazlan, and now it all depends how it fits in. Our Mishnah, which assumes Yeush, according to Raba, where Raba says, basically, remember, Raba said, their machloket, Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis, is biyadua. Even if you know, they still have a machloket. And the Gazlan is going to be mityaesh, according to Rabbi Shimon. So now we're going to combine, we're going to say the following. Rebbi holds that there's no distinction. He disagrees with Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis about this distinction between Ganav and Gazlan. He thinks Ganav is like a Gazlan. But who does he hold like? Ganav is like a Gazlan what? That there is Yeush, there is a Yeush. So now they say, Ganav is like a Gazlan, and a Gazlan, there's always Yeush. And that's what it means. And he holds like a Gazlan, ki Rabbi Shimon. Okay, he holds like a Gazlan according to Rabbi Shimon. He thinks Ganav is like a Gazlan, and you'd have to add to it. And that would be the way we'd explain our Mishnah again. It would explain not our Mishnah, although we're going to go back and explain our Mishnah that way in a few minutes. But the Ganav, the Gazlan, the Ganas, Hekdeshan, Hekdesh, we assume there's Yeush because Rebbi holds even in a Ganav case, Ganav is like a Gazlan. In a Gazlan, there's always Yeush. We're going to assume Ganav also has Yeush, and then we could explain the Mishnah. It's the second way to explain that source, that Tana'itic source, like Rebbi. And then you don't have this question against Raba because Raba was only explaining the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon, and he disagrees. Rebbi is the third position. Now we're going to go into this opinion of Rebbi. Gufa. Rebbi Omer ani Ganav ki Gazlan. So now Ibailu. Now they ask the question that we just gave an answer to, that we said at the very top of this Amud, Kaimalan ki Gazlan, the Rabbi Shimon. But right now we don't know this because we're going kind of backwards. They quote Rebbi as saying Ganav is like a Gazlan, and then they ask Ibailu. Ki Gazlan de Rabbanan Kamar v'lo Kani. Does he mean it's like a Gazlan, a Ganav and a Gazlan? Neither of them we presume there's Yeush, because you think you're always going to think you're going to get it back. O Dilma ki Gazlan de Rabbi Shimon Kamar v'Kane, or is like a Gazlan according to Rabbi Shimon, and it is Kone, a Ganav and a Gazlan. We're going to assume there's always Yeush, and therefore, again, if you steal it and pass it on to somebody else, they will acquire it. So now we're going to go back to the same two sources that we just saw, and read them as if they're Rebbi. Okay, and then we'll have an answer. Tashman, lu mochsim chamoro v'chule, mani. Rabbanan, we're going to go back to the same question. Kasha Gazlan. Rabbi Shimon, Kasha Ganav. But instead of answering the two types of Gazlanim, they're going to say, oh, let's understand it the simple way. Here we have no distinction between Ganav and Gazlan. It doesn't seem to match Rabbi Shimon. It doesn't seem to match the rabbis. Right? Each one is going to have one case that's a problem because they distinguish between the two cases, and these put the two cases in the same category, that there's presumed Yeush. So, Iyamar Bishlama Rebbi ki Gazlan to Rabbi Shimon Ka'amar v'Kane. Hamani Rebbi. So this would work perfect. If you say Rebbi holds that a Gazlan is like a Gazlan, according to Rabbi Shimon, a Ganav is like Gazlan, both we assume Yeush, then that works perfectly with the Mishnah. The Mishnah assumes there was Yeush. And then that's why it's Kone. But if you're going to say Ki Gazlan de Rabbanan Ka'amar v'lo Kane, Hamani lo Rebbi, lo Rabbi Shimon v'lo Rabbanan. If you say that he holds that, you never assume Yeush, like the rabbis. In other words, he holds Ganav is like a Gazlan of the rabbis, and the Gazlan of the rabbis, we don't assume Yeush because you think, oh, I'll never be able to, right? We assume there's no Yeush because, I just said it wrong. Hamane lo, if you say Ki Gazlan like the rabbis say a Gazlan, there isn't Yeush, right? He assumes there's no Yeush by Gazlan because you think you'll get it back because you know to find the Gazlan. Then it doesn't make any sense. To which the Gemara is going to say, what do you mean? You can't prove that that Rebbi holds like Rabbi Shimon, because this Mishna, the only way to explain this Mishna is to say it's Rebbi, and Rebbi holds Ganav and Gazlan are all the same, and they're all the way Rabbi Shimon holds for the Gazlan, where there is Yeush, because Rabbi Shimon, you could explain this Mishna according to Rabbi Shimon the way we already explained it, which is, right, that a Gazlan, there's a difference here. It's not Ganav Gazlan. Ganav and Gazlan are Listim and Listim Mezuyan, right? And it's Rabbi Shimon, and they say again, Yihachi Hanu Gazlan, but that's the same thing, to which they answer, Trei Gavne Gazlan. There's two different types of Gazlan. Okay, next source. Do the same thing with the second source we saw before. Tashma, and do the same thing we just did with this source. Tashma, Ganava, Gazlan, Va'anas, Hekdeshan Hekdesh, Trumatan Truma, Matzvotam Aser. You steal, you grab something, right? And then you sanctify it, you make Truma, you make it Maser, it's effective. Money. Rabbanan, Kasha Gazlan, Rabbi Shimon, Kasha Ganav. Again, this puts Ganav and Gazlan in the same category. Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis each said they were in different categories. So let's go with Rebbi. If you say that Rebbi holds that Ganav is Gazlan, like Rabbi Shimon holds that there's Yeush, because, right, you think I'll never get it back from the strong, tough guy. Mishum Hachikane, that's why it works. And then the Mishnah is exactly that opinion, Rebbi. But then it's not going to match anybody. To which they're going to again answer no. Don't necessarily have to say that, but listim mezuyam for Rabbi Shimon hanu gazlan trei gavne gazlan. Okay, in the end we're going to say no. Maybe both ganav and gazlan are really both types of gazlani. Third source. So we couldn't prove it from there either. So we tried to prove that both those sources we saw must be Rebbi, but we say it's not conclusive. Third source. And here we'll have an answer. Amalei Rabashi Raba Tashma. Dimatne Rebbi Rabbi Shimon Bere. Rebbi taught his son Rabbi Shimon. Here we're going to see what he himself said. Lo davar sheyesh bo achrayut mamash, el afilu para v'choresh ba chamor u'mechamer acharav chayavim lachzir mipnei kvod avihem. This was the mission we saw about what things an heir has to return if his father stole. It's not just things that are land and have a achrayut, guarantees on them, but even a para that people use for plowing or a chamor that people use for carrying things, you have to return because people will see it and say, oh, I know that belongs to your father, and it's going to be humiliating for the father. It's going to be an embarrassment to the father's name. And the father's not alive, but still. So now, what do you learn from here? Halaf kvod avihen lo. Now, it sounds like were it not for the kavod of your father, you wouldn't have to. Shma mina, Rebbi Kazlan de Rabbi Shimon Kamar. Now, what's the issue? It must be, we're assuming, you stole it, you were a Gazlan. And a Ganav, right? This is a Ganav, whether you stole it or whether you're a Gazlan, right? What do we see here? It's a Ganav, right? Rebbi said this case, and now we're going to see a Ganav is like a Gazlan, and it must be like Rabbi Shimon. We're going to assume there was Yeush, because if there was Yeush, you don't have to return it, but you need to return it here for a different reason, because of Kvod Avihen, Shma Mina. But not for that, you would have had to return it because it's not yours, okay? Because, right, you didn't acquire it. Because what happens here, I just want to remind you again, there's Yeush there's the Yeush of the owner when the father stole it. And then there's shinui reshut, which is it goes to the son. That's already the passing on to someone else's domain. Even though he's just an heir and coming in place of the father, we view the heir as a lokach. There's all machloket about whether we do or not, but this presumes that the heir is a lokach, and therefore like a buyer, and therefore it's shinui reshut, it changes domains. Okay, v'chein nechil shel dvorim. Okay, now we're going to go back to that. Why do they have to add this case of the nechil of dvorim? Hachika, afilu nechil shel dvorim dekinyan derabanan. It's only a derabanan. This is like the Yomi. We saw the doves. You might have doves, but they're not 100% yours. So you're not really owned by you because they fly around, they move, they migrate, they go to different places. They don't really have a home. So therefore, it's only a kinyan of derabanan, and they're telling you even in that case. You might have thought, since they only acquired them anyway, they only own them on a rabbinic level, maybe you would think we can just assume Yeush. That's why it has to tell you in the Mishnah, you need to have Yeush, otherwise it doesn't work. So now they say, how can they be accepted as testimony here? So, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, not that we accept their testimony in court, it's we accept it mesiach lefi tumo. If they were just kind of saying it as, someone said, did you see my beehive? And she said, oh yeah, I saw it come out of there. They weren't saying it as testimony. As testimony, we're worried they might not be trustworthy. Why we think children and women might not be trustworthy is a bit of a question in general. but we will believe them for their mesiach lefi tumo. Okay, we don't have time for this, so we're not going to go into it today. But moving on. I'm Rav Ashi. I'm mesiach lefi tumo kasher eleleitu b'isha bilvad. So now they say, wait, but Rabbi Ashi says, we only allow mesiach lefi tumo to allow a woman to get remarried, like saying we saw her husband die. That will allow mesiach lefi tumo of, someone who is saying it, who isn't normally accepted for testimony, will accept it in that way. But not for other things. So how could we allow it for this? I'm really right for this nechil of dvorim. I'm really ravina le Rav Ashi velo. So they say, okay, so first of all, let's just start with this. They don't yet ask as a question. Rav Ashi makes a statement, now they're going to bring our case as a question. Velo, wait, what do you mean? To which they say, that doesn't work here. That's not a question. It's only derabbanan, and that's what we allow. But if it's doraita, we only allow it for allowing a woman to remarry. Udoraita lo, really? For other Torah things, we don't allow it? Second question, we're going to have three questions. I remember being a child. They put me on my father's shoulders, took me out of school. Where they, at the end of school, if she they took off my clothes. It sounds bad, but you'll see in a minute. And they would put me in the mikveh to eat in the evening. And he would even finish the story. There was even more to this. It's kind of funny. My friends stayed away from me because they didn't want to get me impure. So I was kind of ostracized. See how this traumatized this child. And they call me Yochanan, he eats the challah. Because the challah would go to the Kohen, right? Not the challah that we eat on Shabbat. It's the challah that they would separate and give to the Kohen. And Rebbi said, okay, you can eat truma now. We assume you must be a Kohen. This validated his kahuna based on just his own testimony, because he wasn't saying it as testimony. He was just telling us a story. But they say that's not a proof of doraita law, because with truma derabbanan, maybe he only allowed him to eat truma that was by rabbinic law truma. And they didn't let him eat truma doraita based on the story. Maybe it wouldn't have been enough. Third question. Akati doraita lo. Ki ata Rav Dimi amarav Chana Kartigna, va'amrele Rav Acha Kartigna, someone from Kartigna, Mishtai, he would tell the story. Maseh ba lefnei Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, there was a case before Rabbi Shimon ben Levi, va'amrele Maseh ba lefnei Rebbi, maybe it was Rebbi. B'tinok echad, there was a child, she'amasiach lefi tumo, that was telling the story. Va'amar ani v'imei nishvinu l'bein hagoyim, unfortunately very relevant nowadays. We were taken into captivity. Yatzati l'shov mayim da'ati alimi, l'kot etzim da'ati alimi. I was with my mother the entire time. What are we talking about here? This is proving that she was never raped. Okay, unfortunately, a very relevant issue right now. And the child said she wasn't raped. What was the idea? Because if she was married to a Kohen, she wouldn't be allowed to be with her husband. Any shavuya, they basically forbade anyone who was taken into captivity because they was concerned that they were raped. But if this child said, I was with my mother the entire time, we trust that testimony and permit her to go back to her husband. He even married her to a Kohen based on that. Forget about that she was married to a Kohen before. He even allowed her to marry a Kohen. To which the answer, they were just lenient when it came to shvuyot because, okay, now why is that? Because they assume, and this is interesting, that a woman would protect herself and prevent herself as best as she could from not getting raped. Unfortunately, we know this isn't always an option. But if she claims no, then we can assume that. Okay, and if we had this child, we're going to put all that together and allow to permit this. So that was 3 questions on Rav Ashi. Okay, very long daf. Let's go on a little more. This is just review of things we saw before, so it's good. We'll finish with this for today. We saw Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka before, and now we're going to see that he says this was a Tanai Beit Din that Yoshua instituted, that you can go into your friend's field, cut the branch, and just return it to them if your bees are all swarming around there. And then you can insist, though, that the guy have to pay you back for the branch. Okay, this, by the way, means that you can, right now we're going to say, if I have wine and you have honey and your honey's spilling, I can dump my wine, put your honey in my thing, and then and then say, but give me the amount of the wine back. Okay. Okay, you can take off the wood from my donkey, put your flax on my donkey. You can use it to carry your flax and then just pay me back the money for my wood, because the flax is worth more than wood, the honey is worth more than wine, and the loss of your bees is worth more than my branch. So therefore, you compensate me for those things. Okay, we're going to stop here for today. We'll start with the Mishna tomorrow. Very long daf, unfortunately for a Shabbat daf, but is what it is. Getting near this Masechet, near the end of this Masechet with a very long dapim. Although I can't promise Bava Metzia will be any better. No time for a summary today, but you can read the summary on the daf post, and that will be your review. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.